Superfund sites are places of high contamination, designated by the Environmental Protection Agency as needing federal intervention because of a risk to human health and well-being. There are over 1,000 federally designated Superfund sites. These sites are often long abandoned or else beyond the capabilities of the original manufacturers or polluters who created the problem. There are thousands more potential sites that could be labeled Superfund sites but haven't yet received the classification from the EPA. In Harris County, there are 24 Superfund sites ranging from the Inner Loop to Pasadena, Crosby, and nearly to Cypress. Each possess real and immediate threat to local populations' health as well as to plants and animals in the vicinity. Today we're sitting down with the Texas Health and Environment Alliance to discuss a few of these sites, what is being done about them, and how there are potentially hundreds or thousands more of these sites of pollution in the greater Houston area. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in Rice University's Environmental Studies program and the program manager of the Diluvial Houston Initiative, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. So today I'm joined in the studio by our Gulf Streams researcher, Sienna Yen, and Sienna and I are sitting down with Jackie Medcalf, the founder and executive director of THEA, the Texas Health and Environment Alliance. Jackie Medcalf, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Great.
So the first thing we kind of wanted to touch on is you are the executive director and founder of the Texas Health and Environmental Alliance, which is otherwise known as THEA as well. And so what inspired you to found THEA?
I saw the need for an organization like THEA when I was an impacted community member that had no idea that I was living in between 4 Superfund sites and that I had literally boated right on top of one. And my fellow community members were uninformed about the risks in our environment, and I saw the need to help facilitate their concerns with public health and what was going on in our local environment.
Yeah, and for listeners who don't know what a Superfund site is, can you tell us a little bit about its impact on people, or like how prevalent is it here?
Absolutely. So a Superfund site is essentially an abandoned toxic waste site that is listed for cleanup by the federal government. And about half of the U.S. minority population lives within 1 mile of a Superfund site. So it's not that uncommon to live near a site. Most people just have no idea. That's for a variety of reasons we could definitely go into later. But here in Harris County in the Galveston region as well, or here in the Houston-Galveston region, we have about 2/3 of Texas's Superfund sites right here.
Since you bring it up that you were actually out boating on one, I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit just about your own personal experience, both what beyond the fact that you found out about it, but I think you were personally impacted by some of the issues around that Superfund site, and maybe just walk us through the example of what was this one that you're referring to and what made it a Superfund site, giving us a little of those details.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back to 2010.
Okay.
I was studying environmental science and geology, and I at the time was incredibly sick. And I was about 90 pounds. I was losing my hair. I'd lost use of my hands. I was having an average of about 7 seizures a week. And I saw a news report that Houston's tap water was radioactive. And I happened to be in hydrogeology that semester, and I had a case study. So I thought, I'm going to compare our private well water, which I believed was pristine, and compare it to the city of Houston's tap water. And I did for my study, and I was actually really surprised in what I found. I found that our water was contaminated with heavy metals. My professors are the ones that instructed me to go and get myself tested for heavy metals and try to figure out if that's what I was being exposed to, what else I might have been exposed to, and where it could be coming from. So I was tested for 21 heavy metals, and I had 19 of them in me. I was in my early 20s. I had never been in an industrial facility of any kind. And so I just started researching the environment around where my family and I lived. And come to find out, there was one Superfund site in particular that's the San Jacinto River Waste Pit Superfund site. And it was at that time sitting in the river, openly exposed. And I had no idea that that's a site that not only was in the river, full of high concentrations of dioxin, a very toxic carcinogenic chemical compound, but that I had actually been on the river boating with friends, and my friend ran his boat up on the pit. We thought it was a sandbar, and so he got out to push his boat off of what we now know was a toxic waste site, and actually cut his feet on organisms that had made the waste pit their home. And so he cut his feet. He got back in the boat with his feet bloodied, and we had no idea that it was literally one of the worst toxic waste sites in our country.
Wow.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with me. Obviously, you've been through a lot, and I love that you've become an advocate for people that are living near Superfund sites and also those that are being impacted by these Superfund sites. And going back to Thea, can you tell us a little bit more about what Thea does with these toxic waste sites? You guys have worked with the San Jacinto River, I've heard, and just telling us a little bit more about the projects that you've been doing.
Sure, absolutely. So once I realized that site was in fact a Superfund site and that there was a regulatory framework and government process to get that site cleaned up, I started volunteering with a local community group called the San Jacinto River Coalition. And we started applying community organizing, grassroots community organizing with technical science, breaking down the technical information for our fellow community members in a way where everyone could understand it, and media outreach and exposure. So combining those few principles, we found that we could actually create a successful movement to get the site remediated. And so from that experience and knowing how much work it took as a volunteer, I knew if I was really going to see this through, I had to do it for my job. So I never saw myself in the nonprofit sector, but I quickly realized I have to figure out how to raise funds to be able to do this, help pay the bills, because my dad, he has bone marrow cancer. And so I was, helping provide for my family. And it's like, okay, we need to start an organization and to do this work, but also to be able to do more work because we've created this successful model here. And so today we continue working at the San Jacinto site, but we are also pretty heavily involved in two other areas of Harris County. So we're involved at the Jones Road groundwater plume in northwest Harris County. It's just on the border of Houston and Cypress. And then we also work within the communities of Greater Fifth Ward, Denver Harbor, Kashmir Gardens. And in every community we work with, we are at the intersection of contaminants in the environment and public health. And that's really our wheelhouse. Facilitating the concerns of the community members regarding their health, but also empowering them and informing them of their rights to participate in the regulatory process and, the technical information as well so that they can effectively advocate for the change in their community.
I'm listening to hear you talking about this. Obviously, you spoke a little of your own illness and related problems around that. But the fact that your father has cancer, I imagine so many of the communities that you're working with, you're just hearing and seeing stories over and over of people who've gotten ill in relation to these areas. And so something that I'm curious about, one, is I think, many people like you just don't know this is in their backyard. You mentioned that we have 2/3 of Texas's sites, but if people want to know where these sites are, if they want to know if they're at risk, I'm sure your organization, obviously that's a large part of what your organization's working on, but where can they go to find out more? And how many of these sites are we talking about around town?
So there's about 24
Wow.
Superfund sites, but there are also almost 2,000 sites that are referred to as relic sites. These are sites that have not been investigated yet. And so they're old industrial properties, but we just don't know what's there today. And that's something that we really hope to tap into in the future, and that we're actually working on a collaborative effort right now with a couple of universities to try to connect the dots and figure out what's in these sites and how are they impacting people. So right now on our website, we host a map. Our website is txhea.org, and we have a map. It's static, though. It's not interactive. But just to get a general idea, you can look at the map and see, are there any sites in proximity to where you live? And then we list out, whether they're one of these relic sites or a Superfund site. But also, if you're in Harris County Pollution Control actually has a great interactive map that you can, put in the area of interest and find out a lot of information about the sites. And then the EPA actually has a tool called EJ Screen, and it's a great application to find out a variety of factors around where you live. But that's one where you can find out if there's a Superfund site in your area.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, that was a EJ Screen we've definitely plugged on the program before, so I'm always happy to hear a reference to it. But it's excellent to know that Pollution Control also has some really great resources.
They do, and EPA actually started a map, a GIS map on their site that's very specific to Superfund sites. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but you could just Google, EPA Superfund sites, and you can find that interactive map as well.
Great. Thank you.
All right, so I wanted to talk about how climate change, or like hurricanes and natural disasters, like it's happening. Like in 2021, there was the Texas freeze, for example.
Yes.
How do these type of events impact the risks associated with Superfund sites?
Really, they present a risk in a variety of ways. And first, I'll touch on one way that most people might not think about here, and you mentioned it, the freeze. So we work with the Jones Road site, which has a soil vapor extraction system running at that site, which has a lot of underground infrastructure that transports contaminated vapors and groundwater that it's extracting from underground, transports it over to a treatment center offsite. And during the freeze, the treatment center and the infrastructure had not been winterized. And it actually saw damages and breaks in several parts of the vapor extraction system because it didn't have any protection to that freeze. So since then, we advocated for the EPA to winterize the system and even consider turning off the system in certain instances or for certain months of the year. And so even the extreme freezes that we're seeing are impacting these sites. But most commonly here on our coast, what we think about and what we talk about is the risk of the Gulf level rising, the land sinking or subsidence, and the increased frequency and severity in our storms. And at the San Jacinto River Waste Pit site, when we first got involved in this, the EPA was not giving enough attention to the threats of climate change. And in all of the reports that they were being presented by the responsible parties, because that's a catch with Superfund, if there are viable entities that the EPA is holding accountable, they commission all of the studies and all of the work that's done on the site. So you can wind up with a clear conflict of interest, but the picture being painted a certain way. They have their own agenda, right? If they wanted to clean the sites up, the government would have forced them into it. So in the studies they were presenting to the EPA, they were only giving less than 1 page of attention to the threat of floods should they leave the waste in the river, which is what the companies wanted to do. So we actually hired a coastal expert to study the effects of flooding and the risks at that site. And to do that, you look back at historical data as well. It's one of the basic principles of geology. The past affects the present and the future. And so looking at, the historical flood data, but then also simulating what could happen in the future should our area get hit with different category hurricanes or a tropical storm. And what we found was that actually past floods had very likely carried contaminants from the site. Now, these are contaminants that prefer to stay in the sediment. They bind to sediment. But if they're picked up by storm surge, by, potentially a flood north of the river that's washing down and out to the bay and out to the Gulf, then these contaminants very likely could get picked up and transported to other areas. So looking at where historically the river has flooded, where those floodwaters have gone in our communities, what schools they've gone across, is really important to look at when we're considering the potential threats.
Something, that comes up for me in that, and I mean, part of your organization's name is health, right? I mean, it's very much thinking about, you've already mentioned cancer risk and some of these broader health risks, but, especially as we think about these contaminants, I'm curious if you can talk about what are some of the consequences that might exist from these contaminants? What are some of the risks that, I think most of us hear, toxic waste, and we're like, okay, yeah, I don't want to go near that. That sounds terrifying.
Right.
But, certainly cancer is among them, but I think there are other ramifications and impacts that you might want to highlight for us about just some of the ways that, exposure to these toxins can be really personally devastating.
Absolutely. So the community that I come from has about 30% of the pregnancies there have at least one serious adverse outcome. I almost lost my son at 21 weeks. You get out of your first trimester and you think, I'm good, right? Made it through the first few months. I had no idea how delicate the entire process was, but that, that I could have lost him at 21 weeks. And then to know that the community that I come from, actually about 30% of pregnancies have, a very serious complication, which is terribly sad. And across the board, your proximity to a Superfund site impacts your ability to have a child that is healthy. About 20 to 25%, or the risk increases by about 20 or 25% to have a pregnancy with a congenital defect if you live near a Superfund site. So there are consequences for in utero, for carrying a pregnancy to term. But then, there's also things that we don't think about that we could receive exposure to. For example, contaminants, whether it's in our drinking water or is it in our soil? Or could we be inhaling a gas? Looking over at the Jones Road site and even in Fifth Ward, harmful gases are coming up through the ground. So we could be exposed in our yards, but there's also the potential to be exposed in our homes. So thinking about, whether it's a young woman or a pregnant mom or someone who has cancer, there's a variety of ways that one could be exposed, and oftentimes it's unknowingly.
To piggyback on that, then, one of the things that you've now scared into me is this variety of ways that we can be exposed. And so I'm really curious about, you've mentioned maps where you can see this, but, it sounds like these are things that carry over. These are things that move through all these different ways that you're talking about. What does that mean in terms of how we can work to combat some of this or control some of what are some of the steps that either the federal government or that local government need to be taking to help protect our health and our communities?
The role of researchers is incredibly important in this, and so I definitely don't want to miss that piece also, right? Because when we have a process like Superfund, these are processes that take decades, and so there are gaps, right? There are things that are not being looked at that should be looked at. And so one, I'd say we all have a role to play in this, but to the individual, for all of us individually living here, really in America, I believe we should all protect ourselves from the water that comes in our home. Bottled water is not the answer. It's not the solution. I believe every home should have a filter on the house at the port of entry. So when the water comes in, it should be filtered, and the water should be filtered before you drink it as well, because our water laws really are not set on what's protective of human health. They're set on what's feasible at a mass scale. And so the other disconnect there is that people who have a private well, like my family once did, often think they're great. And we see that, in the community I come from. We see that in the Jones Road community, where people are not really smelling, tasting, or seeing the chemicals in the water, but it doesn't mean that they're not there. And when you have your own well, nobody's looking out for it. Nobody's testing the well that's on your property and making sure the water coming into your home is safe. There's a one-time test that's done when the well is built or put in, but it's looking for really basic bacteria, not some of these more complex contaminants. And so when we're looking at this, there's the more immediate threats and needs, and then there's the policy piece, right? Like what can we be doing on a policy level to actually have better laws to as we find out that there are more of these sites around, to implement better practices and policies to protect our communities.
What are some of those policy solutions?
So one is, I'll give an example, chromium. Chromium-6 is at a very high level, or was,
Can you break down a little bit more for us what chromium-6 is?
Yes. So chromium-6, so it's actually a naturally occurring element. And it can be found in chromium-3 or chromium-6. And the regulation in our drinking water is only total chromium. So let's say the city of Houston was supplying water to the community, one zip code in particular in A-Leaf, supplying them water from 8 wells. Now, because they were wells on a public supply, they were being regulated. But the regulation was total chromium. As long as all chromium is under a certain threshold, there's no violation. There's nothing legally wrong with the water that's being provided.
Okay.
Doesn't matter if it's chromium-3, which happens to be actually nutritional for our bodies, but chromium-6 is harmful for our bodies. And doesn't matter, though, however much 3 or however much 6, as long as it's below the threshold. And actually, the Environmental Working Group was looking into chromium-6 on a national level and saw that this one area has the 3rd highest rates of chromium-6 in the tap water in the entire country. And so we honed in on it. Folks started asking us, hey, can you help us get to the bottom of it? And come to find out, there was one well in that zip code of the 8 wells, there was one well that had abnormally high levels of chromium-6. And so even though the policy and the regulation didn't require the city to test for that individually, our organization and community members were pushing the city, hey, we're concerned. Will you please start monitoring this individually? And so they did, and found that well and ended up shutting the well down.
Wow. I mean, I think that research piece is also, I think folks are quick to often say, oh, we just need to test or we need to do more testing.
Right.
And testing is really expensive and really complicated and takes time. And that's not me saying we shouldn't be testing. It's an issue of, and especially somewhere like Houston, where we're so big and so interconnected, it's really difficult because you were pointing out, right? An exposure in one area might travel downstream through a river or through an event, through airflow. And so I think you're absolutely right. We need this research, but also it seems like we need more sustained, consistent efforts, and not just by local. Community activism is important and critical in this, but it can't just be a community, taking responsibility for their own water supply. It seems that clearly we need more of this government intervention to really take up some of that ownership, because this is just bigger than what most kind of block by block communities can accommodate when we're talking about these large scale issues.
Absolutely. I will call myself an environmental activist by accident, so let me put on that hat really quick.
Yes.
Data is not going to set you free. Data is not going to be the end-all, be-all for a community that's being impacted, especially if there's a big corporate giant on the other end. You will always get out-experted, out-lawyered, and outdated, right? And so some of these contaminants are hard to find, and as you mentioned, the tests can be really expensive. The Jones Road area, the water testing there that we do is incredibly inexpensive, under $100
Oh, wow.
for a one-time test of the contaminants we're looking for. Go over to the east side where I'm from, a one-time test of the contaminants we look for there, the types of dioxin, you're talking $1,000 and upwards for a one-time test. And it depends what you're testing, right? Whether you're testing groundwater. Well, it doesn't move quick, but it does move. And so you test it once, you might not get something if you're testing the water. So then you have a false sense of security that your water's fine based on that one-time test. Well, 6 months down the road or maybe 6 months prior, there could have been contamination there. You just didn't catch it. Another example is, doing soil testing. The thing that comes to mind is Swiss cheese. And I'm going to hope I say this right because it's literally just popped in my head. Okay, so imagine Swiss cheese and say one of the holes is a spot that has dioxin. Well, if you are pulling your sample of soil from one of the other holes, you're not going to catch dioxin because it's over in one of the other holes, right? So then you're going to think my soil is safe. My child can go and play in the soil and put their toys in their mouth, or my dog, can run around the yard and be safe when it's actually a false sense of security. So testing is very complex and expensive, but it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the thing that sets you free. You have to layer many different areas really to create change.
Well, and that's interesting because since we're running with the metaphor of Swiss cheese, often I think something that environmentalists talk about actually is a Swiss cheese approach to solving some of these solutions based. And what they mean by that is if you're only taking one slice of Swiss cheese, you have all these holes, right? And there's all these gaps, and all of a sudden there's various issues where things can get through, and so you have to layer different potential solutions on top of each other. You need 3 or 4 pieces of Swiss cheese to start to address some of these issues. And so I'm wondering about, you've mentioned testing, which exactly, it is important and crucial. And of course, the research is important, as you've said. But exactly, it is really expensive, and it means testing often for one thing or a couple of things that you think might be in the area. And as you said, a bad sample can just ruin the whole process. And so what are some of the other things that we should be doing or that we need to be doing in communities to help layer some of those protections from these chemicals in different sites?
One thing that I was learning in my environmental management course in college was that if it is the environment impacting your health, your household is not alone.
Yeah.
But we don't commonly talk to our neighbors about our health. You don't see your neighbor and wave and say, hey, I just got home from chemo.
Yeah.
You just don't. Most people don't. And talking to our neighbors is one of the most important things we could be doing, because if your household is suffering from, let's say, lupus, you might have several other neighbors that are also struggling with that autoimmune disease, and it might actually be at an abnormal rate. But if we're not talking about it, we don't know about it. I'll give an example here of why that has importance if you're trying to really get to the bottom in, say, a scientific way. When the state health department does a cancer assessment or a disease assessment, they have to pull the data by cancer type or by disease type. They can't just pick a geographic area for a specific time period and find out all the types of cancer that were diagnosed there in that area during that time period. It's just not the way their database works.
Yeah.
They have to go type by type. So in the communities I come from, we worked with the state health department, and they looked at 17 types of cancer because those were the types of cancer we were commonly seeing. We started going door to door, right? So talking to your neighbors. And we found out, okay, here's 17 types of cancer we most commonly see. Some of them we weren't that concerned about because maybe, for example, we'd seen them like once, but we still handed them over. The state came back with 14 of them in abnormally high rates. We got so much more than we bargained for out of that assessment. And it all came from talking to our fellow neighbors. So layering over just that, the foundation of communication in the community, but also with effective communication to our agencies and our elected officials. If we're communicating with our elected officials and our agencies in a really long and drawn out and scattered manner, it's not going to be as effective as if you have that, quick elevator pitch, if you will, like that quick paragraph, 30 seconds, minute, just snapshot of what you're concerned about and what you need. Because let's face it, they have a lot on their plate. They have a lot of people to worry about. But if you stick with it and you have clear and concise messaging, it's really important to the overall process.
Great. Thank you. And it's always helpful to have, suggestions on how we should be talking with our public leaders, which we don't talk about often, but is an important part of this conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a lot of government work that you have to do. Are there a lot of challenges associated with working, let's say, with the EPA or just the local, state, or national government in general?
There are challenges, and I'd say the greatest challenge is that we ultimately don't control the outcome at the sites. There are things which we can control, right? Our community engagement, how many people we reach, how we reach people, what the messaging is. But we don't ultimately control the outcome. And that is challenging, right? We can organize, like we did at San Jacinto, over 55,000 voices for our position.
Wow.
And we had a victory, right? That got us to where the EPA ruled in our favor and against the companies. They ordered full removal.
Wow.
But that was in 2017, and only half the site's been remediated. So though we had a really, really big victory there, the battle goes on. The fight goes on, right? We are still continuing to push to get the main site, the one I beached on top of on the boat, that one out of the river. And so that's a big challenge when you have parties that have a specific interest. And the government hears from them all the time, right? They're hearing from them all the time. But we're a nonprofit organization who has, a decent funding base, a decent supporting base. And we still don't have the capacity in each of these areas for them to be hearing from us all the time. So that communication piece and capacity piece is always a challenge, going back to kind of the you'll always get out lawyered piece. But when I first started doing this work here in Harris County, people would say, oh, no, don't go meet with that state representative. He's conservative. He wears a suit and boots every day. You're not going to get anywhere with him. You're talking about the environment. And I said, I'm going to go meet with him. I believe everybody should care about this because to me, I don't care what party you vote for. I care about the impacts of our environment on our health. I believe everyone, doesn't matter who you are, I believe everyone has the right to live, work, and play in a safe environment that's not going to make you sick. And so for me, I said, we're going to go at this from a human perspective. It's about all of us. We're all in this. And so we've been able to navigate the different political parties very well, coming at this, one, with sound science and information, but also from a human element. And so in San Jacinto, we secured all of the representatives in the Houston-Galveston area, and it was really divided. 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats. And people said, you'll never do it. But navigating it, hasn't been as challenging as we would have suspected.
Well, I think that's actually a really critical part of this whole conversation, right? Is certainly there are folks who are going to hear anything that sounds quote unquote environmental and just, that's tree huggers and we're worried about whatever, and while the majority of Americans, recognize climate change as a real thing and are, at least some level of concerned about it, there are certainly folks who are not. But health tends to be something that really cuts across in an interesting way. And all of these things are connected. And so I think, constantly thinking of different kind of prongs in the conversation to bring people into the reality of we have to be treating where we live better. We have to be doing better by our communities because the consequences cost lives. I mean, this is life and death that we're talking about. And so I think that's a really critical piece of this conversation.
Absolutely. It is. And, for so many of us who have lost loved ones, who, take care of loved ones, have lost pregnancies, it really is a matter of life or death. And our communities are burdened by these health problems, and they shouldn't be. It should not be as prevalent as it is. And each of the 3 communities we work with have abnormally high rates of cancer. And the studies that have been done in 2 of the communities have also shown abnormally high rates of birth defects.
So this is obviously a huge public health issue, and thank you so much for sharing all this. And I just want to know more about what are you guys doing currently? What are some of your goals for the rest of 2024, and just some projects that you've been working on right now?
One of our big goals at the Jones Road Superfund site is to get the EPA to bring in a piece of equipment that can test for vapors under the slabs of the homes in the community.
Wow.
Other communities like Jones Road in the country, where basically it's a community predominantly or historically supplied by groundwater that lives above a plume of old dry cleaning contaminants. We're finding that they are oftentimes being exposed to higher concentrations of the chemicals through gas in their yards and in their homes than from the chemicals in the well water that they're pulling into their home. But the EPA has not until very recently tested any of the homes for vapors. After several years of us and residents pushing them to test for vapors, they have tested a couple of homes inside. There's a lot of complexities with that, a lot of ways that you can get false readings testing for these contaminants in the home. So we're requesting that they bring in a piece of equipment to put underneath the slab of the home to catch the vapor before it goes into the home. So that's a really big goal there, and something we're working towards at Jones Road. And we are actually right now working with Texas Department of State Health Services for an updated cancer investigation in the communities around the San Jacinto site. And we will continue pushing for a full and complete cleanup at that northern site because, they're still trying to figure out how they're going to tackle that and whether or not the EPA is going to take that site over or if they're going to let the companies continue as they have been. And then in Houston's Fifth Ward, one of the things that we're working on right now is breaking down the technical data that's come out very recently related to soil, water, and vapor testing, helping folks understand what exactly that means, but then also advocating for an updated health study there.
So you mentioned the EPA again, and I feel like we forgot to kind of touch on what is the EPA's role in all of this, and with the Superfund sites, are they overseeing you guys? Are they deciding who's winning, which case? Just love to hear about the EPA in general.
Right. So the EPA's process is a critical component of this. The Superfund process is the process that has the capacity to remove the threat. That's the process where the actual threat from the contaminated material can be cleaned up, safeguarded from the communities. So at the EPA in Fifth Ward communities, they actually stepped into what was a state process or a process being overseen by Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And what was being done there was wholly inadequate. The community wasn't being tested. Things were not being required to be done year after year from the polluter. And so after the community really standing up and saying, hey, we're not going to take this anymore. We need more help. The state of Texas isn't helping us like we need. Who can help us? And the city of Houston and the EPA stepped up and said, we're going to see that something is done here. And so the EPA has taken over oversight in that area, but it's not actually a Superfund site. So it's a real unique situation we have going on there. It's a site being managed under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which the difference is there's an active business there. The activities that created this site, the business is still active today. Whereas, San Jacinto and Jones Road, those being Superfund sites, there's no longer the polluting business taking place there. So the continued involvement of EPA there is essential because they're the decision maker. They hold the power to make the decision to get these sites cleaned up effectively.
Great. So lastly, we're starting to run out of time, but I just want to give you the opportunity to tell us a little bit about ways that folks can get involved with THEA, and if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing or support your work or volunteer, what should they do to get involved, and how can they help support your mission?
You can help support our mission by helping with your dollars or your time, right? We're a nonprofit, so you can help us continue and further our mission by supporting us by volunteering or by donating to our mission. Our website is txhea.org. We've worked very hard on our website. I hope you will go to it and find use in it. You can sign one of the letters that we have there as well. So again, lending your time, lending your signature to one of our causes or all of them. And then one way you can get involved in the future, if you're interested, we are actually going to be launching an environmental health leadership program. And so we actually just received a grant to develop the curriculum for this program. And in the next year, we will be launching a program where we develop local leaders and help them learn our tactics and learn our ways. Because with over 24 of these Superfund sites and nearly 2,000 relic sites, we cannot even touch these sites quick enough. So we're starting in the communities. We're going to train local leaders how to take on these efforts for their own community. So you can contact us on our website if you'd be interested in joining one of our programs.
That's fantastic. Well, Jackie, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Jackie Medcalf is the founder and executive director of the Texas Health and Environment Alliance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to follow up with an update from this story. We taped this a couple of weeks back, and since then, I have received word from Jackie that there's some new news regarding activity in this area, and specifically on waste pits. So the EPA on April 18th, 2024, communicated via email that it's not going to be proceeding with the previously warned takeover of the Superfund process. So originally, in January, the agency had noticed an issue of a notice of takeover to the responsible parties, which are the International Paper Company and Waste Management subsidiary McGuinness Industrial Maintenance Corporation. And so the EPA identified serious deficiencies in both these companies' remediation plans and demanded a response within 20 days. Basically, what wound up happening, according to Jackie, is that the response that was received was nothing more than a plan to eventually create a plan. And so this has been really frustrating for local communities, especially in the San Jacinto River. And it points to the reality that the EPA is not engaging in the way that local communities really want, not moving to really extract these different companies from taking ownership over the problem and to start engaging. And instead, it's really putting local communities in a position where there's genuine concern about how the EPA is going to move in. And so the EPA does have the ability to just take legal authority and to assume control of this Superfund site, but it's instead chosen to grant the parties another 90 days to finalize the design for remediation. So basically, the EPA could be taking over this series of sites and instead has decided to continue working through the private sector with the companies who originally polluted, which is not uncommon. As we said at the top of the episode, there are thousands and thousands of possible Superfund sites. There are thousands that exist, over 1,000 that exist around the nation as it is. And so the EPA doesn't always assume responsibility for each of these sites. But when you're working with parties who have continually put off the process, who don't want to seem to take ownership, that's generally a time where the EPA would step in, and that seems to be the case in this circumstance. To that point, Harris County Precinct 3 Commissioner Tom Ramsey has said that he's standing in solidarity with the and has joined the call for the EPA to take over the Superfund process at the pits. And so multiple people have come out. The commissioner has expressed concern and saying, quote, I've never witnessed a more glaring display of incompetence than what I observe at the waste pits. The people in this area deserve better, end quote. And so this has been a really frustrating process for the folks around San Jacinto River. It continues to leave this in a unresolved state as there are another 3 months for the process to advance. So we recorded this episode a few weeks back. We were hoping to have a more positive update on a remediation plan. And in reality, this is what the work often looks like. This is what the process of involving the federal agencies tends to take. This is slow-going work, and it's deeply frustrating and harmful for those communities who are most affected, who want to see, action as soon as possible and want to see a remediation plan, a genuine remediation plan built out and authorized as quickly as possible to make their neighborhoods safer. So thanks again to Jackie for sending us this update and for letting us know where things currently stand. If you want to get involved, I would strongly suggest reaching out to your local representatives and demanding that these sites be taken with all seriousness by the federal government, that they, act to try to move the EPA to engage around these topics, and also that we act locally to really try to hold these companies accountable, as we've been doing and we're seeing with other related Superfund sites like former creosote plants in the Fifth Ward. These stories really do add up, especially when people on the ground start getting involved, demanding change, getting their local and federal government involved so that these sites that are injurious to all of us and that impact everyone in the greater region, can be mitigated and returned to a more livable condition and at less risk for all of us. Thanks again to Jackie for this update. Now we'll go to Sienna, who has another piece in her series on environmental myth-busting.
Hey everyone, welcome to Environmental Myth-Busting, where we navigate and unravel environmental and climate myths. Today we're diving into a topic that's both crucial and often misunderstood in our discussions about climate change, the concept of net zero emissions. Many believe that achieving net zero will instantly stop global warming, meaning our global temperatures will stop rising. But is that really the case? Let's find out. Let's start with the basics. What does net zero mean? Net zero is essentially about achieving a balance between the greenhouse gases we emit into the atmosphere and the amount we manage to remove. Achieving net zero is crucial for slowing climate change, but it doesn't provide an immediate fix to global warming. This is because of the persistence of carbon dioxide already in our atmosphere and its long-lasting effects. Even as we aim for this balance, we must recognize that carbon dioxide, once released, lingers in the atmosphere for centuries. This means that the CO2 we've emitted since the onset of the Industrial Revolution continues to warm our planet. Think of carbon dioxide like a guest who overstays their welcome, not just for a few hours, but for a few generations. And once it's in our atmosphere, it sets up shop, trapping heat and contributing to higher temperatures, melting ice caps, and leading to more extreme weather events. This means that even if we stop all emissions right now, the carbon dioxide already present will continue to affect our climate system. The heat trapped by these gases will keep influencing global temperatures, ocean currents, and weather patterns for many generations to come. Essentially, our climate system doesn't adapt to changes overnight. It reacts slowly to changes, especially our oceans, which absorb about 90% of the planet's excess heat. The vast mass of the world's oceans means they heat up slowly, but they also retain this heat for a long time. So even if we could magically stop all emissions today, global temperatures would likely continue to rise for several decades due to the heat already absorbed by the oceans. This lag between reducing emissions and seeing actual changes in climate conditions is critical to understand. It means that actions taken today to reduce emissions won't immediately reverse global warming, but are still so crucial for long-term climate stability. They don't reverse global warming immediately, but are still fundamental in managing the rate of change and giving human and natural systems time to adapt. So stopping emissions would not return us to the climate of our ancestors, but it would prevent temperatures from rising beyond a certain threshold, which is incredibly important. Scientists estimate that even if we stopped emitting CO2 from fossil fuels today, the climate would eventually stabilize at a higher temperature than what previous generations experienced, due to the delayed response in temperature rise as the atmosphere catches up with accumulated heat. The response of our ecosystems to warming is also a significant concern. As our planet experiences warming, it also changes in ways that can exacerbate problems. For instance, thawing permafrost, melting ice, and warming oceans contribute to a self-sustaining cycle of warming due to released methane and CO2. These changes highlight why achieving net zero isn't just about reducing emissions, but also enhancing our planet's ability to absorb carbon through forests, oceans, and soil. It's a complex puzzle that requires both mitigation and adaptation strategies. Despite these challenges, there are compelling reasons for hope. International collaboration on climate action is stronger than ever. At the COP28 United Nations climate talks in December 2023, governments from nearly 200 countries agreed to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels in the crucial decade, making significant commitments to reduce their carbon footprints. Renewable energy technologies like solar, wind, and hydroelectric power have seen exponential growth over the last decade. They are becoming more efficient, more affordable, and more widely adopted than ever before. For instance, solar energy capacity globally has increased tenfold in the past decade, significantly reducing the cost of clean energy. The world has also added 510 billion watts of renewable energy capacity in 2023, 50% more than in 2022, and equivalent to the entire power capacity of Germany, France, and Spain combined. The next 5 years are expected to see even faster growth in renewables. And let's not overlook the power of public awareness and advocacy. People from all walks of life across the world are demanding action and influencing policy changes. Again, while our actions today may not instantly curb the rise in global temperatures, they hold immense value for the future. Even though the reduction in emissions won't provide an immediate cooling effect, these efforts are absolutely crucial for achieving long-term climate stability. By acting now, we are laying the groundwork to slow the progression of climate change, which is essential for maintaining a livable planet. Each measure we implement, each technology we develop, and each policy we enact contributes to a broader, cumulative effect that stabilizes the climate over time. Overall, this slow but significant progress helps us manage not just temperatures, but also the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, ensuring a safer, more resilient world for future generations. So for now, it's crucial that we work without delay to achieve net zero emissions. That's all for today's episode of Climate Myth Busting. Stay curious, stay informed, and remember that our actions are indeed powerful and they matter deeply. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next time.
Lastly, we'll hear from our researcher Jaden Bray-Boyce, who will tell you how you can get involved this week in Houston.
Hey y'all, this week we're welcoming the month of May. So let's take a moment to go over some of the ways you can get active and volunteer in the Houston area this week. To start, let's highlight one great organization, Houston Audubon. In recent years, research published in a peer-reviewed study revealed that Houston ranks second among U.S. cities in exposing night migrating birds to the dangers of light pollution, just behind Chicago. This is a critical issue because many migratory birds fly at night, and the bright lights of urban buildings can attract and disorient them, leading to collisions or leaving them behind to vulnerable ground threats. To help mitigate this issue, Houston Audubon is working with organizations like Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Texan by Nature to launch bird collision monitoring programs. These initiatives ultimately aim to gather data that will later help us better understand the issues and work towards long-term solutions. The monitoring process involves teams of volunteers patrolling predetermined routes around downtown in the early mornings. No prior experience is required, but volunteers will receive thorough training on data collection and how to handle any injured or deceased birds that they may encounter. The data collected will then be entered into the iNaturalist app, where experts can assist in species identification. If you're passionate about conservation and looking for a great organization to volunteer with, consider registering to volunteer with Houston Audubon. There is a mandatory training, so be sure to watch the collision monitoring training videos before signing up. These monitoring trips will take place all month long from 6:30 a.m. to 9 a.m. in downtown Houston. If this great opportunity piques your interest to get out and get involved in the Houston area this month, please don't hesitate to sign up. So with that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and a great start to the month of May.
Up next time on Gulf Streams, we'll be talking about how games can help us better imagine new futures for our environment, climate, and selves. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Research support provided by Jaden Bray-Boyce and Sienna Yen. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.